In the world of royal protection, training prepares you for many things: gunshots, crowds, protesters, bomb threats. But nothing truly prepares you for that moment when time slows down, your heart stops, and you have less than 3 seconds to decide between your own life and someone else's. On a quiet Tuesday morning in March 1974, Inspector James Beaton thought it would be just another routine escort duty. Princess Anne was returning from a charity event. The London streets were calm, and the motorcade was running smoothly. He had done this hundreds of times before. Check the route, monitor the radio, watch the crowd, keep the princess safe. But at 7:45 p.m. on the Mall, everything changed in an instant that would echo through British history forever. What happened next wasn't just about one man's courage. It was about a split-second decision that revealed the true meaning of duty, sacrifice, and what it really means to serve something greater than yourself. This is the story of a moment that lasted 3 seconds but took a lifetime to understand. Some say heroes are born. Others believe they're made through years of training and discipline. But sometimes, heroes are simply ordinary people who, when faced with an impossible choice, don't hesitate to do what's right. This is one of those stories. Inspector James Beaton had never imagined his life would revolve around watching other people live theirs. Growing up in a small Scottish village outside Edinburgh, he dreamed of adventure, of making a difference, of serving his country in some meaningful way. His father worked in the local textile mill. His mother tended to their small garden and raised 3 boys with the kind of firm discipline that builds character. James was the middle child, neither the achiever like his older brother, nor the charmer like his younger one. He was the steady one, the reliable one, the one who could be counted on when things went wrong. At 18, James joined the Metropolitan Police, not because he had grand visions of heroism, but because it seemed like honest work that mattered. The training was rigorous: physical fitness, weapons handling, crowd control, emergency response, and endless hours of learning protocols that seemed designed to cover every possible situation. But the instructors always emphasized one thing above all else. In the moment of crisis, all the training in the world means nothing if you freeze up. The difference between a good officer and a great one isn't knowledge or skill. It's the ability to act without hesitation when action is required. James excelled in his early years on the beat. He had a calm presence that seemed to diffuse tense situations before they escalated. His partners appreciated that he never tried to be the hero, never sought glory, but could always be trusted to do his job properly. Supervisors noticed that citizens rarely complained about their interactions with Beaton, and when they did write letters, they were usually praising his professionalism and kindness. It was this reputation that caught the attention of the Royal Protection Unit recruiters in 1971. The RPU was expanding, needing officers who combined physical capability with the temperament required to spend long hours in close proximity to the royal family, without becoming either too familiar or too distant. The psychological profile they sought was specific: unwavering loyalty, absolute discretion, physical courage without recklessness, and the ability to remain alert and professional during what were often long periods of routine, punctuated by moments of intense pressure. The selection process was exhaustive: physical fitness tests that pushed candidates to their absolute limits, psychological evaluations that probed every aspect of personality and mental stability, background investigations that examined not just the candidate's history, but that of their family members, friends, and associates, combat training with firearms, defensive tactics, and emergency medical procedures. But perhaps most importantly, scenarios designed to test split-second decision-making under extreme stress. James passed every test, but it wasn't his scores that impressed the evaluators most. It was his consistency. While other candidates had spectacular performances in some areas and weaknesses in others, James demonstrated the same steady competence across every challenge. He wasn't the fastest runner or the best marksman or the most charismatic interview subject, but he was solid, reliable, and completely unflappable under pressure. His first assignment was with Prince Charles, then a young man beginning to take on more official duties. James learned quickly that royal protection was unlike any other form of security work. The threats were real and constant, but often subtle. A suspicious person in a crowd might be an assassin or simply an overeager photographer. A change in routine could indicate a security breach or merely a royal whim. The officer had to be prepared for violence while remaining invisible, ready to die for someone they were trained never to think of as a friend. The relationship between protector and protected was carefully calibrated. Too distant, and the royal family member might feel isolated or develop a false sense of security. Too close, and professional judgment could be compromised by personal feelings. James found his natural temperament perfectly suited to this balance. He was warm enough that his charges felt comfortable, but professional enough that boundaries were never questioned. After 2 years with Prince Charles, James was reassigned to Princess Anne. The Princess Royal was known for her no-nonsense attitude, her dedication to charitable work, and her impatience with unnecessary protocol. She rode horses competitively, maintained a busy schedule of official engagements, and had little patience for security measures that she considered excessive. This made her both easier and harder to protect than other royals. Easier because she was cooperative and understood the realities of her position. Harder because she was willing to take risks in pursuit of her duties and didn't appreciate being treated like a fragile flower. James quickly developed a professional rapport with Princess Anne based on mutual respect. She appreciated that he never tried to restrict her activities unnecessarily, and he appreciated that she never put herself or others at risk carelessly. Their working relationship was smooth, efficient, and built on unspoken understanding of each other's roles and responsibilities. The work itself followed predictable patterns. Early morning briefings about the day's schedule, route planning, coordination with local police and venue security, and then the careful choreography of getting the princess safely from point A to point B, while allowing her to fulfill her official functions. Most days passed without incident. The biggest challenges were usually logistical. Unexpected changes in timing, larger than expected crowds, or weather that disrupted outdoor events. But James never forgot his training about being prepared for the unexpected. Every crowd was scanned for potential threats. Every route was analyzed for vulnerabilities. Every person who approached the princess was evaluated for suspicious behavior. It was exhausting work that demanded constant vigilance while appearing relaxed and natural. The threats against the royal family were real and well documented. The IRA was actively targeting British institutions and had made specific threats against royal family members. International terrorist groups saw attacking the monarchy as a way to strike at the heart of British identity. Mentally unstable individuals sometimes became obsessed with royal family members and posed unpredictable dangers. And there was always the possibility of opportunistic criminals who might see kidnapping or assassination as a path to notoriety or financial gain. James had studied every major security incident involving the royal family in recent history. The 1936 incident, when someone threw a revolver at King Edward VIII. The 1960s attempt to derail the train carrying Queen Elizabeth. The ongoing concerns about IRA bombing campaigns. Each incident was analyzed for lessons learned, procedural improvements, and insights into how future attacks might be prevented or responded to. But all the training and preparation in the world could not fully prepare someone for the reality of being personally responsible for another person's life. James understood intellectually that his job might require him to take a bullet meant for Princess Anne. He had practiced scenarios where he would shield her with his body or engage armed attackers while she escaped to safety. But understanding something intellectually and being emotionally prepared for it were two different things. The weight of that responsibility was something James carried with him every day. When he woke up in his small London flat each morning, his first conscious thought was about the day ahead and his duty to keep Princess Anne safe. When he went to bed each night, his last thought was often reviewing the day's events for anything he might have missed or handled differently. It was a burden that few people could understand, and fewer still would willingly accept. But James had accepted it completely, not because he sought glory or recognition, but because he believed deeply in the importance of service. The royal family represented something larger than themselves, something that connected Britain to its history and values. By protecting them, he was protecting an institution that mattered to millions of people. It was work that gave his life meaning and purpose. As 1974 began, James had been with Princess Anne for nearly 2 years. Their professional relationship had settled into comfortable routines. He knew her preferences, her habits, her concerns, and her schedule. She trusted his judgment and rarely questioned his security recommendations. To observers, they seemed like a well-oiled team, each understanding their role and executing it flawlessly. But beneath the smooth surface, James remained constantly alert for the crisis that his training told him was always possible. In quiet moments, he sometimes wondered how he would react when that moment came. Would his training take over? Would he freeze at the critical instant? Would he have the courage to do what duty demanded, even if it meant sacrificing his own life? On the morning of March 20th, 1974, James woke up with no premonition that this day would be different from any other. He followed his usual routine: physical exercise, breakfast, review of the day's schedule, check of his equipment, and departure for the palace to begin another day of keeping Princess Anne safe. It seemed like it would be just another routine day and a job built on routine. He had no way of knowing that before the day was over, he would discover exactly what kind of man he really was. The morning of March 20th, 1974 began, like any other, for Inspector James Beaton. His alarm rang at 5:30 a.m., and he followed his established routine with the precision that had become second nature over years of service. Physical training in his small flat, a simple breakfast of porridge and tea, and a careful review of the day's schedule that had been delivered the night before. Princess Anne was scheduled to attend a charity film premiere, followed by a reception for Save the Children Fund, an organization for which she served as patron. The weather forecast called for light rain in the afternoon, nothing that would significantly impact the planned activities. The venues had been inspected and secured. Local police had been briefed on timing and routes. The princess's personal detective, Inspector Beaton, and her driver had coordinated every detail. From a security perspective, it was a straightforward day with manageable risks and well-established protocols. But what James couldn't know was that across London, another man was also preparing for this day with his own careful planning and deadly intentions. Ian Ball was a 26-year-old drifter whose life had been marked by a series of failures, disappointments, and growing mental instability. Born to middle-class parents, he had shown early promise as a student, but had never been able to sustain success in any endeavor. Jobs lasted only a few months before he quit or was fired. Relationships ended quickly when his partners recognized his unpredictable moods and grandiose fantasies. By 1974, he was living alone in a run-down bedsit, surviving on unemployment benefits and nursing elaborate grudges against a world that he believed had failed to recognize his importance. Like many individuals who eventually commit acts of spectacular violence, Ball's descent into dangerous obsession had been gradual. He spent his days consuming newspapers and television coverage of current events, gradually developing conspiracy theories that explained his personal failures as part of larger societal problems. The royal family became a particular focus of his resentment, representing in his mind everything that was wrong with British society. Privilege, tradition, and what he saw as the crushing of ordinary people like himself. Ball's plan, which he had been developing for months, was both simple and audacious. He would kidnap Princess Anne, hold her for ransom, and use the publicity to broadcast his political views to the world. In his fantasy, he would be remembered as a revolutionary who had struck a blow against the establishment and forced society to confront its inequalities. He seemed unable to grasp that his plan would more likely result in his death or life imprisonment, and that few people would be interested in the political opinions of someone who had committed such a crime. The technical aspects of Ball's plan revealed both his cunning and his fundamental disconnection from reality. He had stolen a Ford Escort and fitted it with false license plates. He had acquired 2 handguns through criminal contacts along with ammunition and handcuffs. He had studied Princess Anne's schedule and identified what he believed would be a vulnerable moment when her car would be traveling through a relatively isolated area. But his planning also showed crucial gaps that revealed his amateur status and unstable mental state. Ball had no real escape plan beyond vague ideas about hiding in the countryside. He had no secure location prepared for holding a hostage. He had not considered how he would communicate his demands or how authorities might respond to a kidnapping attempt. Most critically, he had seriously underestimated the training, equipment, and determination of the people whose job it was to protect Princess Anne. On the morning of March 20th, Ball conducted what he considered final preparations. He loaded his weapons, checked his equipment, and reviewed his plan one more time. Then he drove to the area where he intended to intercept Princess Anne's car, arriving hours early to observe the location and finalize his timing. To anyone who might have noticed him, he probably appeared to be just another person running errands or waiting for someone. Meanwhile, Princess Anne was proceeding through her scheduled activities with the professionalism and dedication that characterized her approach to royal duties. The charity film premiere went smoothly, with the expected crowd of well-wishers, photographers, and dignitaries. The princess moved through the event with practiced ease, speaking with organizers, posing for photographs, and fulfilling her role as patron. To James, who maintained his position near her throughout the event, it was a routine engagement handled with typical efficiency. The reception that followed was equally successful. Princess Anne spoke briefly about the importance of the Save the Children Fund's work, met with major donors and volunteers, and participated in the kind of networking that was essential to successful fundraising for charitable organizations. She was in good spirits, engaged with the people she met, and seemed to be enjoying the evening's activities. As the reception concluded and preparations began for departure, James conducted his standard security sweep. He confirmed that the route back to the palace remained clear, that the driver was ready, and that all necessary personnel had been notified of their departure time. Everything appeared normal, and he had no reason to expect that the return journey would be anything other than routine. Princess Anne's car that evening was a Austin Princess limousine, a large, comfortable vehicle that provided both luxury and security features appropriate for royal transport. The driver was Alex Callender, an experienced chauffeur who had been driving for the royal family for several years. In addition to James, the car also carried Inspector Michael Hills, another protection officer, and Rowena Brassey, one of Princess Anne's ladies-in-waiting, who had accompanied her to the evening's events. The route back to Buckingham Palace took them through some of London's most famous areas, including the Mall, the broad avenue that leads directly to the palace. Under normal circumstances, this was one of the safest possible routes for royal transport, well patrolled by police and familiar to security personnel. The time was approximately 7:45 p.m., and traffic was light for a weekday evening. As they travelled down the Mall, the atmosphere in the car was relaxed. Princess Anne was reviewing notes from the evening's conversations, discussing follow-up actions that would be needed for various commitments she had made. James was monitoring radio communications and observing their surroundings with his usual attention, but nothing seemed amiss. The street lighting was good, visibility was clear despite the earlier rain, and they were making good time toward the palace. What none of them could see was Ian Ball, positioned in his stolen Ford Escort at a strategic location along their route, watching for the distinctive outline of the royal limousine and preparing to put his plan into action. Ball had been waiting for over an hour, growing increasingly nervous as time passed and doubts about his plan began to surface. He had consumed several cups of coffee and was feeling jittery from both caffeine and adrenaline. His hands were shaking slightly as he gripped the steering wheel, and he had to keep wiping sweat from his palms despite the cool evening air. Part of him wanted to abandon the whole scheme and drive home, but his desperate need for significance and his delusional belief in his plan's righteousness drove him forward. When he finally spotted the approaching Austin Princess, Ball felt a surge of excitement mixed with terror. This was the moment he had been planning for months, the action that would transform him from a nobody into someone who mattered. He started his engine, checked that his weapons were accessible, and prepared to change the course of British history. The collision course was set. In the royal limousine, 4 people who were simply doing their jobs and fulfilling their duties were approaching a confrontation that would test everything they believed about courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. None of them suspected that within minutes, their quiet evening would explode into violence that would make headlines around the world and create a story that would be told for decades to come. As the distance between the two vehicles closed, time seemed to slow down for everyone involved. Ball gripped his steering wheel tighter, his heart pounding as he prepared to ram the royal car and begin his kidnapping attempt. In the limousine, James continued his professional observation of their surroundings, his trained eyes scanning for anything unusual, while his mind remained focused on the primary mission that had guided his entire career: keeping Princess Anne safe. Neither man could know that within moments, they would be locked in a life-and-death struggle that would reveal the true nature of courage under fire and demonstrate the difference between those who talk about heroism and those who embody it when the moment demands action. The impact came without warning, a tremendous crash that shattered the quiet evening and sent Princess Anne's limousine skidding across the Mall. Ian Ball had accelerated his stolen Ford Escort to maximum speed before ramming into the rear quarter panel of the royal vehicle, the collision violent enough to spin the heavy Austin Princess sideways and bring it to a jarring halt in the middle of the road. Inside the limousine, the occupants were thrown violently against their seats and each other. James Beaton's head struck the window beside him, sending stars across his vision, but his training kicked in immediately. Even as he fought off the disorientation from the crash, his hand was already moving toward his service weapon, while his eyes searched for the source of the attack. Princess Anne had been thrown forward against the seat in front of her, and James could hear her sharp intake of breath. But she seemed conscious and alert. The driver, Alex Callender, was struggling with the steering wheel, trying to assess whether the car was still operational and whether they could escape from whatever had just happened to them. Inspector Michael Hills was already reaching for his radio to call for backup, but before he could key the microphone, the real terror began. Ian Ball had leaped from his damaged Ford Escort almost before it came to a complete stop. He was moving with the jerky, unpredictable energy of someone whose adrenaline and desperation had pushed him far beyond rational thought. In his right hand, he carried a .22 caliber pistol, and his eyes had the wild, unfocused look of someone who had crossed a line from which there could be no return. "Get out of the car," Ball screamed, his voice cracking with emotion and stress. "I want the princess. Get out now, or I'll kill everyone." The scene that unfolded next happened with the surreal quality of a nightmare. Ball began firing his weapon, not with the calculated precision of a trained gunman, but with the frantic desperation of someone who had never actually fired a gun in anger before. His first shots went wild, shattering the rear window of the limousine and sending glass fragments flying through the passenger compartment. James Beaton's response was immediate and instinctive. Years of training had prepared him for exactly this moment, and despite the chaos and confusion around him, his mind became perfectly clear. His first priority was getting between the gunman and Princess Anne. His second was neutralizing the threat, and his third was calling for assistance. Everything else was secondary to those three objectives. "Stay down, Your Royal Highness," James commanded, his voice calm and authoritative despite the circumstances. He was already moving, positioning himself between Ball and the princess while drawing his own service weapon. But as he opened the car door to engage the attacker, Ball's erratic shooting found its mark. The bullet struck James in the shoulder, spinning him partly around and causing him to lose his grip on his pistol. The pain was immediate and severe, but James barely registered it. His only thought was that he was now unarmed while facing a gunman who was clearly intent on reaching Princess Anne. Without hesitation, James threw himself directly at Ball, attempting to tackle him and prevent him from getting closer to the car. The two men crashed to the ground together, James using his body weight and momentum to try to pin Ball down while reaching for the gunman's weapon. But Ball was younger, lighter, and driven by a desperate energy that gave him surprising strength. He managed to break free from James's grip and scrambled several feet away, still clutching his pistol and wild with rage that his plan was not proceeding as he had imagined. "I'll kill you all!" Ball shouted, raising his weapon toward the car where Princess Anne remained. "This is my moment. The world will remember me." But Ball had made a critical error in his planning and preparation. In his fantasies about kidnapping Princess Anne, he had imagined that her protectors would be easily overcome or intimidated into submission. He had not anticipated the level of training, dedication, and sheer physical courage that men like James Beaton brought to their duties. Even wounded and temporarily disarmed, James was far from finished fighting. Inspector Hills had managed to exit the car from the opposite side and was moving to flank Ball while radioing for emergency backup. But the streets around the mall, usually busy with pedestrians and traffic, seemed strangely empty at that moment. The few people who might have witnessed the attack had either fled at the first sign of violence or were too far away to provide immediate assistance. Princess Anne herself was displaying the kind of composure under pressure that had been bred into the royal family for generations. Despite being in mortal danger, she remained calm, following James's instructions to stay low while keeping herself positioned to escape from the car if an opportunity presented itself. Her lady-in-waiting, Rowena Brassey, was beside her, both women understanding that their survival might depend on the actions of the two protection officers who were risking their lives to save them. Ball's second shot struck the pavement near James's feet, sending chips of asphalt flying. His third shot hit the car's tire, causing it to deflate with a loud hiss. But his wild shooting was actually working against him, as each missed shot gave James more time to recover and plan his next move. Despite the pain in his shoulder and the blood that was beginning to soak through his jacket, James was calculating angles, distances, and opportunities. The key moment came when Ball, frustrated by his inability to get a clear shot at Princess Anne, moved closer to the car. This brought him within range of James, who, despite his wound, still possessed the speed and skill that had made him an elite protection officer. James feigned weakness, slumping slightly as if the blood loss was affecting him more than it actually was, drawing Ball into a false sense of confidence. When Ball stepped close enough to peer into the car window, James struck, moving faster than seemed possible for a wounded man. He grabbed Ball's gun hand with both of his own hands, twisting the weapon away from Princess Anne, while simultaneously driving his knee upward into Ball's midsection. The impact drove the air from Ball's lungs and sent him stumbling backward, but he managed to maintain his grip on the pistol. What followed was a desperate struggle for control of the weapon that seemed to last forever, but actually took less than 30 seconds. Both men were now covered in blood from James's shoulder wound, making their grip slippery and uncertain. Ball was screaming incoherently about revolution and justice, while James fought with the cold professional focus of someone whose entire world had narrowed to a single objective: protecting Princess Anne. Inspector Hills had managed to get behind Ball and was preparing to intervene. When the decisive moment arrived, Ball, in his desperation to break free from James's grip, made the mistake of pulling the trigger while the gun was pointed toward the ground. The bullet struck him in his own leg, causing him to cry out in pain and surprise. The shock of wounding himself caused his grip to loosen just enough for James to wrench the weapon completely away from him. With the immediate threat neutralized, James's training took over completely. Despite his wound, despite the adrenaline crash that was beginning to affect him, despite the surreal nature of what had just occurred, he followed proper procedure. He secured Ball's weapon, helped Hills restrain the attacker, and immediately turned his attention to ensuring that Princess Anne was unharmed. "Are you injured, Your Royal Highness?" James asked, his voice steady despite everything that had happened. "I'm perfectly fine, Inspector," Princess Anne replied with the kind of calm dignity that had characterized the royal family's response to crises for centuries. "But you're bleeding quite badly. We need to get you medical attention immediately." The sound of sirens was now filling the air as police units and ambulances responded to Hills's radio calls for assistance. Within minutes, the mall would be swarming with emergency personnel, investigators, and the media representatives who had been monitoring police radio frequencies and arrived almost as quickly as the first responders. But in that moment, as James Beaton stood guard over the subdued Ian Ball while blood continued to seep from his shoulder wound, he was not thinking about the media attention or the investigation that would follow. He was not considering the commendations he would receive or the way this incident would be remembered in the history of royal protection. He was simply doing what he had always done, his job, the job he had trained for, prepared for, and accepted as his responsibility. The job that, on this March evening in 1974, had required him to place his body between a gunman and Princess Anne without a moment's hesitation. As the first police cars arrived and officers began securing the scene, James finally allowed himself to acknowledge the pain from his wound. But even as paramedics began treating his injury, his eyes remained on Princess Anne, ensuring that she was safe and that the threat had been completely eliminated. The attack was over, but its repercussions were just beginning. Within hours, the story would be front-page news around the world, analyzed by security experts and debated by commentators who had never faced a moment of real danger in their lives. Ian Ball would face trial and imprisonment, his delusions of significance replaced by the reality of spending most of his remaining life behind bars. But for James Beaton, the meaning of what had happened was much simpler. When the moment came, when everything he had trained for and prepared for was put to the ultimate test, he had not hesitated. He had done exactly what duty demanded, and Princess Anne was safe. In the end, that was all that mattered. The immediate aftermath of the attack on the mall was controlled chaos. Within minutes of Inspector Hills's emergency radio call, police vehicles began arriving from multiple directions, their sirens wailing through the London evening. Uniformed officers established a perimeter around the scene, while armed specialists moved in to secure the area and ensure that Ian Ball posed no further threat. Emergency medical personnel rushed to treat James Beaton's shoulder wound and check all the occupants of the royal limousine for injuries. Princess Anne, despite having just survived an attempted kidnapping, demonstrated the kind of composure that had been instilled in her from childhood. She remained calm as paramedics examined her for any injuries from the collision, answered preliminary questions from investigators, and made sure that her lady-in-waiting was receiving appropriate medical attention. But those closest to her could see the slight tremor in her hands and the way she kept glancing toward where James Beaton was being treated, clear signs that even royal training could not completely shield someone from the psychological impact of such a terrifying experience. James, meanwhile, was fighting the paramedics' attempts to transport him to the hospital immediately. Despite the significant blood loss from his shoulder wound and the obvious pain he was experiencing, he insisted on remaining at the scene until he was certain that Princess Anne was completely safe and that all security protocols had been properly implemented. It took direct orders from senior officers and Princess Anne's own insistence that he seek medical treatment before he would consent to being taken to the ambulance. "Inspector Beaton," Princess Anne said firmly as he was being loaded onto a stretcher, "you have done your duty admirably. Now please allow the medical personnel to do theirs." The scene around the damaged vehicles quickly became a complex investigation site. Forensic specialists began collecting evidence, photographing the damaged cars, and mapping the positions of shell casings and bullet impacts. The Ford Escort that Ball had used in the attack was thoroughly searched for additional weapons, explosives, or clues about his planning and motivations. Every aspect of the incident would need to be documented and analyzed, both for the criminal prosecution of Ball and for the security review that would inevitably follow. Ian Ball himself was a study in the collapse of grandiose delusions. The wild energy that had driven him to attack a royal motorcade had evaporated, replaced by the dazed confusion of someone who was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had done and the consequences he would face. The bullet wound in his leg was painful, but not serious, And as police medical personnel treated it, he began asking questions that revealed his disconnection from reality had been complete. "What will happen to me now?" he asked one of the arresting officers, as if he genuinely expected that his political action might be viewed with some sympathy or understanding. "You'll be charged with attempted kidnapping, assault with a deadly weapon, and several other serious crimes," the officer replied matter-of-factly. "You're looking at life in prison." The media response was immediate and overwhelming. News organizations that monitored police radio frequencies had reporters and camera crews at the scene within 30 minutes of the attack. By the time the immediate emergency response was complete, journalists were arriving from newspapers, television stations, and wire services around the world. The attempted kidnapping of Princess Anne was international news of the highest magnitude, and the story would dominate headlines for days to come. But the media attention also created additional challenges for the investigators and security personnel. Photographers were attempting to get close-up shots of the damaged vehicles and the blood on the pavement. Reporters were trying to interview anyone who might have witnessed the attack. Television crews were setting up live broadcasting positions that threatened to interfere with the ongoing investigation. Senior police officials found themselves having to manage a major crime scene, while also dealing with unprecedented media scrutiny. The decision was made to transport Princess Anne back to Buckingham Palace immediately, both for her safety and to remove her from the chaos of the crime scene. A replacement vehicle was brought in, and she was escorted by a heavily armed police convoy through streets that were now filled with emergency vehicles and media representatives. The normal protocols for royal transport had been completely disrupted, and security officials were operating under emergency procedures that assumed additional attacks might be imminent. At the palace, senior members of the royal household were already being briefed on what had happened and what measures would be taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. Queen Elizabeth was informed of the attack on her daughter within an hour of its occurrence, and she immediately summoned the heads of the various security agencies responsible for royal protection. The investigation would be thorough, but even more importantly, every aspect of royal security would be reviewed and strengthened. James Beaton was taken to St. George's Hospital, where surgeons worked to remove the bullet from his shoulder and repair the damage to muscle and bone. The wound was serious but not life-threatening, and doctors were confident that he would make a full recovery. But as he lay in the recovery room, heavily medicated and finally allowing his body to rest after the massive adrenaline surge of the attack, James was already thinking about the changes that would inevitably follow. He knew that this incident would transform royal protection procedures in ways that might never be fully visible to the public. Routes would be varied more frequently. Security details would be expanded. Intelligence gathering about potential threats would be intensified. The comfortable routines that had characterized much of royal security work would be replaced by protocols that assumed a much higher level of ongoing danger. The investigation into Ball's background and motivations began immediately and would continue for months. Detectives interviewed his family members, former employers, landlords, and anyone else who might provide insight into how an apparently ordinary young man had developed such a dangerous obsession with the royal family. What they discovered was a pattern of mental illness, social isolation, and gradual radicalization that would become disturbingly familiar in later decades as similar attacks occurred around the world. Ball had been unemployed for several months before the attack, living alone in increasingly squalid conditions while his mental state deteriorated. He had no close friends, no romantic relationships, and no meaningful connections to any community or organization that might have provided stability or intervention. His days were spent consuming media coverage of political events and developing conspiracy theories that placed himself at the center of imaginary struggles between good and evil. The weapons he had used in the attack had been obtained through connections to petty criminals in London's underground economy, but the investigation revealed that he had made no effort to obtain more sophisticated equipment or training that might have made his attack more dangerous. His planning had been elaborate enough to allow him to intercept the royal motorcade, but not sophisticated enough to provide any realistic possibility of success. In many ways, it appeared that Ball had been more interested in the dramatic gesture than in actually accomplishing his stated goal of kidnapping Princess Anne. The psychological evaluation of Ball would reveal a complex mixture of mental illness, personality disorders, and what would later be recognized as the kind of narcissistic rage that drives many mass violence incidents. He believed himself to be exceptionally intelligent and important, but the world had consistently failed to recognize his significance. The attack on Princess Anne was his attempt to force society to acknowledge his existence and pay attention to his opinions. But while the investigation into Ball's motivations provided insights into the mind of someone capable of such violence, it also revealed the randomness and unpredictability of this type of threat. There had been no specific warning signs that might have allowed authorities to prevent the attack. Ball had not made threats against the royal family that came to official attention. He had not purchased weapons or equipment through channels that were monitored by law enforcement. He had simply been one disturbed individual among millions, invisible until the moment he chose to act. This realization was sobering for security professionals who were responsible for protecting high-profile targets. No amount of planning, training, or intelligence gathering could eliminate the possibility that someone like Ian Ball might decide to mount an attack. The best that could be done was to prepare protection officers like James Beaton to respond effectively when such incidents occurred. The public reaction to the attack was intense, and generally supportive of both Princess Anne and the officers who had protected her. Letters and telegrams poured into Buckingham Palace expressing relief that she had not been harmed, and admiration for her composure during the incident. James Beaton received similar correspondence praising his courage and dedication to duty, though much of it was forwarded to him at the hospital where he was recovering from his wound. But the incident also sparked broader discussions about the security of the royal family and whether existing protection measures were adequate in an era of increased political violence. Some commentators argued that royals should be more heavily protected, with larger security details and more restricted access to public events. Others contended that excessive security would fundamentally change the nature of the monarchy and reduce its connection to ordinary citizens. Princess Anne herself made it clear that she did not want the attack to result in changes that would prevent her from fulfilling her royal duties effectively. In her first public statement after the incident, she emphasized her gratitude to the officers who had protected her, but also her determination to continue her work on behalf of the charitable organizations she supported. "I will not allow the actions of one disturbed individual to prevent me from carrying out my responsibilities to the people and causes that depend on the work of the royal family," she declared. The best response to this attack is to continue serving the public with the same dedication and accessibility that has always characterized the British monarchy. As James recovered in the hospital, he found himself grappling with the realization that his life had been permanently changed by those few minutes on the Mall. He would be decorated for his courage, promoted within the protection service, and remembered as the officer who had risked his life to save Princess Anne. But he was also beginning to understand the psychological toll of having been in a situation where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death for someone he was sworn to protect. 3 weeks after the attack, James Beaton was released from the hospital with his arm in a sling and strict instructions to take several more weeks of recovery time before returning to active duty. The bullet had been successfully removed from his shoulder, but the doctors warned that rushing back to physically demanding work could result in permanent damage to his mobility. For someone whose career depended on physical capability and quick reflexes, this was not advice to be taken lightly. But James found that the physical healing was the easy part of his recovery. The psychological impact of having been in mortal combat, of having made split-second decisions that determined whether Princess Anne lived or died, created a weight that he had not anticipated. Sleep came fitfully, often interrupted by dreams that replayed the attack in endless variations, where different choices led to different outcomes. Sometimes he dreamed that he had been too slow, that Ball had succeeded in reaching Princess Anne. Sometimes he dreamed that his own hesitation had cost lives. The recognition that followed was both gratifying and overwhelming. Within days of the incident, James was informed that he would receive the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian award for gallantry, in recognition of his courage in protecting Princess Anne. The citation would read, in part, that Inspector Beaton had displayed exceptional bravery and selfless dedication to duty in the face of armed attack, placing his own life at risk to protect Her Royal Highness without regard for personal safety. Letters of commendation arrived from senior officials throughout the government and security services. The Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police visited him personally to express the gratitude of the entire force. Newspapers editorialized about his heroism and dedication. But perhaps most meaningfully, Princess Anne herself visited him in the hospital, bringing with her a personal message of thanks that she had written herself. "Inspector Beaton," she said as she sat beside his hospital bed, "I want you to know that I understand exactly what you did for me that night, and I will never forget it. You had every reason to seek your own safety when that madman started shooting, but instead you put yourself between him and me. That kind of courage and loyalty is beyond what anyone should be asked to give, yet you gave it without hesitation." James, uncomfortable with praise under the best of circumstances, struggled to find an appropriate response. "Your Royal Highness, I was simply doing my job. Any officer in my position would have done the same thing." Princess Anne shook her head firmly. "No, Inspector. Not every officer would have done what you did. Training can prepare someone for many things, but it cannot create the kind of moral courage that you demonstrated. What you did came from something deeper than professional duty. It came from the kind of person you are. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Princess Anne asking detailed questions about his recovery and his plans for the future. But what struck James most was her evident understanding of what the incident had meant for him personally. She seemed to grasp that being in a situation where he might have died, where others might have died because of his actions or failure to act, was not something that could be simply forgotten once the physical wounds healed. The trial of Ian Ball became a media sensation, with detailed coverage of every aspect of his background, motivations, and mental state. James was required to testify about the attack, describing for the court and the watching public exactly what had happened during those crucial minutes on the mall. The experience of reliving the incident in such detail, of being questioned by defense attorneys who seemed to be trying to find fault with his actions, was emotionally exhausting. Ball himself proved to be an unrepentant defendant who seemed to believe that the notoriety of his trial vindicated his decision to attack Princess Anne. He testified in his own defense, delivering rambling monologues about political injustice and his belief that dramatic action was necessary to wake up British society. His complete disconnection from the reality of what he had done, his inability to comprehend the suffering he had caused, was both disturbing and pathetic. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding Ball guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 20 years before being considered for parole. In delivering the sentence, the judge noted that Ball's actions had not only endangered Princess Anne, but had also forced brave officers like Inspector Beaton to risk their lives in defense of their duty. For James, the conclusion of the trial marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. His shoulder had healed sufficiently for him to return to light duties, but the question of his future role within the Royal Protection Unit remained open. The incident had made him famous in a way that could potentially compromise his effectiveness as a protection officer, since his face was now recognizable to anyone who had followed news coverage of the attack. More importantly, James found himself questioning whether he wanted to continue in a role that had proven to require such extreme personal sacrifice. The attack had shown him that he was capable of the kind of courage that duty demanded, but it had also shown him how easily things could have gone differently. If Ball had been a better shot, if James had been a fraction of a second slower, if any of a dozen variables had been different, the outcome could have been tragic. During his extended recovery period, James spent considerable time reflecting on what had drawn him to protection work in the first place, and whether those motivations were still sufficient to sustain him through a career that he now understood could demand everything he had to give. The comfortable routines and manageable risks that had characterized most of his service had been shattered by one evening's violence, and he was not certain they could be rebuilt. The decision about his future was complicated by the recognition and opportunities that had followed his heroic actions. He was offered positions with private security firms that would have doubled his salary. He was approached about writing a book about his experiences. Television producers wanted to interview him about royal protection and the realities of security work, but all of these opportunities felt somehow inappropriate to James, like profiting from what he saw as simply having done his job. Instead, he found himself drawn to the idea of using his experience to improve the training and preparation of other protection officers. The incident with Ball had revealed gaps in standard procedures and assumptions about how such attacks might unfold. James believed that sharing his first-hand knowledge could help prepare other officers for the realities they might face and potentially save lives in future incidents. This thinking led to his assignment to the training division of the Royal Protection Unit, where he would spend the next phase of his career developing new protocols and teaching young officers about the practical aspects of close protection work. It was not the kind of glamorous assignment that might have been expected for someone who had received the George Cross, but it was work that felt meaningful and important to James. His first lecture to a class of new recruits was scheduled for 6 months after the attack. Standing before the group of eager young officers, James felt the weight of responsibility for preparing them for realities that he hoped they would never face but knew some of them inevitably would. "The most important thing I can tell you," he began, "is that all of your training, all of your preparation, all of your planning comes down to one moment when you have to decide what kind of person you really are. You can't know how you'll react to that moment until it arrives, but you can prepare yourself mentally and emotionally to do what duty requires." He paused, looking at the faces of the young officers and remembering his own eagerness and confidence when he had first joined the protection unit. "Some of you may never face a situation like what happened to me on the mall. Others may face something even more dangerous. But all of you need to understand that this job is not about personal glory or recognition. It's about serving something larger than yourself, and sometimes that service demands everything you have to give. The lecture continued for over an hour, with James sharing practical lessons about situational awareness, threat assessment, and emergency response. But the heart of his message was about the moral and psychological preparation that he believed was even more important than physical training or technical skills. As the years passed, James continued his work training new protection officers while also serving as a consultant on security improvements and threat assessment procedures. The incident with Ian Ball became a case study that was taught to law enforcement agencies around the world, and James occasionally traveled to share his insights with other protection services. But perhaps the most lasting impact of that March evening in 1974 was not on security procedures or training protocols, but on James himself. The experience had shown him that when the ultimate test came, when everything he believed about duty and service was put to the most extreme challenge, he had not hesitated to do what was right. That knowledge became a source of quiet confidence that sustained him through the rest of his career and his life. In 1994, 20 years after the attack, James was invited to attend a reception at Buckingham Palace celebrating the anniversary of Princess Anne's founding of several charitable organizations. As he approached Princess Anne in the receiving line, she immediately recognized him despite the years that had passed. "Inspector Beaton," she said warmly. "How wonderful to see you. I hope you know that not a year goes by that I don't think about what you did for me that night. Your courage gave me the opportunity to continue serving in ways that have brought meaning to my entire life." James, now older but still carrying himself with the bearing of a professional protector, smiled as he shook her hand. "Your Royal Highness, knowing that my actions allowed you to continue your important work, has always been the greatest reward I could have received." As he left the palace that evening, James reflected on the strange turns his life had taken because of one moment of crisis on the Mall 20 years earlier. He had never sought to be a hero, had never wanted fame or recognition for doing his job. But he had discovered that sometimes life demands heroism from ordinary people. And when that moment comes, the measure of a person is not whether they feel afraid, but whether they act despite their fear. The boy from the Scottish village who had joined the police force simply because it seemed like honest work had become a man whose courage under fire would be remembered long after his name was forgotten. He had learned that heroism is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. And he had learned that the truest rewards come not from recognition or praise, but from the knowledge that when duty called, he had answered without hesitation. That, James Beaton knew, was enough.